Hi everyone, I'm Giorgia Nadizar and I'm going to present our work title on the schedule for morphological development of evolved modular soft robots. So let me start with the motivation. That is basically why we even bother to investigate this topic. So when you observe nature, phenotypic development is pervasive and it happens at different levels, both body and brains and whatever of individuals. And if you don't trust me, I also have some evidence for you. So here are three recent pictures of me, Eric, and Karine, the three authors of this study. And if you doubt we developed, well, we actually did develop. And these three pictures also act as evidence that development is indeed beneficial, at least in real life. And some groups have also shown it to be beneficial in artificial life, and they have worked on similar agents as we do. The first group has proved that development can guide evolution towards better performance, whereas the second group has encompassed environmental feedback in development to obtain more adaptable agents. So, we have seen the importance of development, but nobody has ever bothered to investigate if there is an importance in the scheduling of development. And actually, nobody has ever asked themselves if the development schedule actually impacts on the effectiveness on the evolved agents. And this is the topic of our study. So now that we know the motivation, let me describe the ingredients of this presentation. First, I will talk about voxel-based soft robots, that are the robots that we work on. Then, I will talk about their development, and last, about the experimental evaluation we perform. So, let's start. Voxel-based soft robots. As we can see in this image here, are aggregates of soft cubes that we call voxels, and they have a morphology that describes their body and a controller that is basically their brain. So let's start talking about their morphology. First, the morphology describes the shape of their body that can be described as a two-dimensional grid of voxels. Here we work in two-dimension for simplicity reasons, but our findings are conceptually portable to the three-dimensional case. Then, concerning the morphology, we need to describe the movement of these agents. And that happens because the voxels can contract and expand similarly to what happens to biological muscles. And last, concerning the morphology, we have the sensors that allow the robots to perceive themselves and the environment surrounding them. Then, of course, we have the controller, because a robot without a brain does not do anything meaningful. And the controller acts to process the sensors and to give meaningful values to the actuators. And we experiment with two controllers, a phase one and a neural one, that we will see in the next two slides. Let's start with a phase controller. In this case, the control signal for each voxel is simply computed from a sinusoidal function, as we can see in this formula here. So the actuation for the ith voxel is computed from this function, and we can see that the only thing depending on the voxel index is the phase. So all the voxels share the same amplitude and frequency. The only thing that differs is actually the phase, as we can also see in this image here depicting a schematic version of a robot composed of three voxels. And we see that the waves are more or less the same. The only thing that differs is how they are shifted. Of course, this is an open loop kind of controller, meaning that there is no actual environmental feedback involved because the sensors are not used. And the only thing that differs from the voxels is the phases, so this is what we optimize. Another form of controller that is a bit more sophisticated and complex and inspired by the brain is the neural controller. And the name comes from the fact that we use a neural network to process the sensor readings. We use a distributed form of controller, meaning that the intelligence, so the neural network, is actually distributed in the body of the agent because we place the neural network within each voxel. And it does not only process the sensors to produce the actuation values, but we actually use communication channels between the neighbors to allow information passing between neighboring voxels. We use it in a homo-distributed kind of architecture, meaning that all the voxels are the same, and they share the architecture, but also the parameters of the neural network. And so this is what we optimize. That is, we optimize the weights of these neural networks. And as a side effect, this neural network here can control maybe not as effectively, but it can control a robot composed of 3, 10, or whatever amount of voxels. Okay, now we have our robots. How do we develop them? We define morphological development as the addition of new voxels to the body of the agent during its lifetime at specific time instance. So the most important thing, at least for our study, is the schedule that prescribes the instance during the lifetime of the agent when the addition of this voxel occurs. Obviously, we need another thing, that is the development function, which describes how the development of the robot is performed. For simplicity reason, we define it as a function going from integer to robots. So when we feed it with an integer value, it outputs a robot that is composed of at most n voxels. And it has the additional property that d of n differs from d of n plus 1 for at most one voxel, meaning that d of n plus 1 has gained, let's say, a voxel compared to d of n. To represent this function, we need to take into consideration the fact that even though we work on morphological development, we also need to encode a controller for the robot. And so we can see the function as a combination of a morphology development function and a controller development function. And we experiment with two representations for the morphology development function and with three representation for the controller development function. And let's start with the representation for the morphology function. The first one is probably the most straightforward representation one can come up to if we think of robots as a two-dimensional grid. That is a matrix of real values. We start from a vector here that we simply rearrange into a matrix. And then we move from the matrix to a Boolean, a real valued matrix to a Boolean matrix. And this is maybe the least intuitive step, even though it's still quite easy. And then from here, we move to a robot in an obvious manner, I would say. Let me focus on this step a little bit. So first of all, we select the element with the highest value in the matrix. Here we have this one that we highlight in a slightly darker color. And then we iteratively select the highest valued element among the connected ones. So we move to this one, and then to this one. And because we stop because we have selected 4. If we had to select additional elements, we would choose among the gray ones. And so now we have described how to move from here to here, and then obviously here we just select the colored, so the set element. Another representation that we experimented with is the tree-based one, which is probably a bit less intuitive. Here we make a correspondence between tree nodes and elements of the matrix, and the children of each node represent the neighbors, listed in north, south, east, and west order. So we start by selecting the first element, the root, and we express it in the matrix. And then we proceed selecting the highest valued child of the nodes that are already expressed. So we move to this one, and then to this one, as we can see here. However, here we have an additional complication, that is some nodes cannot be expressed. And I will give you the example of this node here. So when we start from the root, we move north, but we cannot move south anymore, in the sense that this node is already expressed. So this node here cannot be selected anymore. And this is particularly important if this node had children, because these children would be neglected from expression. And so, again, of course, after moving to the Boolean matrix, it's quite trivial to move to the robot. Now that we have seen the representation for the morphology, let's see those for the controller here. The first representation that we experiment with is a vector-based one that encodes for the phase controller. And here the genotype basically corresponds to the vector of phases of the voxels. And similar representation goes for the vector-based neural controller, a neural representation encoding for the neural controller, and the genotype here is simply the vector of neural weights. A slightly more complex representation is for the tree-based phase representation, where the genotype is a tree of real values, actually a tree of phases, and this is only used in conjunction with a tree-based morphology representation. So, the 4 development functions here. The first one is a grid phase representation, And the genotype is a vector that is split in two parts. The first encoding for the vector-based morphology representation, the second one encoding for the vector-based face representation. So in this case, we have a face controller. Quite similar, but with a neural kind of controller, is the grid neural one. And then here we have the tree-based morphology. So here we have a tree phase, and the genotype is actually a tree of pairs, pairs of real values that get split into two trees after having been through the genetic operators. And so the first tree encodes for the tree-based morphology representation, the second tree encodes for the tree-based face controller, so face controller here. And then last, we have an heterogeneous kind of genotype, where the first part is a vector encoding for the controller, the neural controller, and the second part is a tree encoding for the tree-based morphology representation. So now that we have the representation, we can also describe how to evolve them. And we use a very standard mu plus lambda evolutionary algorithm that I will not focus too much about. And we use some genotype dependent elements for initialization, crossover, and mutation. Now let's move on to the experimental evaluation. And we try to address the following research question. What is the most appropriate development schedule for artificial agents? And we also investigated if that depended on the representation chosen for the development function. To evaluate this, we chose a classical task in evolutionary robotics, that is locomotion. The idea is that the robot needs to locomote, so run, as fast as possible on a fixed kind of terrain. Here we generate a robot initially, and we develop it at every time step in its development schedule. And we use the distance run as the fitness, because we keep the time of the episode fixed. Meaning that, of course, if the robot has run longer, it has necessarily been faster than the others. Some more details about it. We experiment with 3 development schedules. An early one that let's say, is inspired by biological growth. So at the beginning of the lifetime, there are more frequent development steps, and then the robot is left untouched for the remainance of its life. Then a uniform development schedule where development occurs at equally spaced intervals. And last, we have no development that is considered as a baseline. But to be fair, we had the robot respawn according to the uniform schedule. Because when we develop, we actually make the robot respawn to avoid conflicts. For example, if we have to add the new voxel below the feet, for example. And so obviously respawning slows the robot down a little bit. And so this is why we actually add the respawning to the non-development case. And again, for fairness, we use different starting sizes to ensure that the robots have the same weighted average size during the simulation. And the weighting factor here is the size times the time that the robot has been that size, as we can see in these images down here. And so we try to equalize the area below these plots. So an example of expected development that is actually a bunch of screenshots taken from a real simulation is in here. So we start from 8 voxel, we add another one, we have another one, and so on and so forth until the simulation ends. So here are the first results that we obtain. Here we show the distribution of fitness for different representation. Here we have grid phase, grid neural, tree phase, and tree neural, and for different schedules. So early in bluish, uniform in orange, and non-development in grayish. And we obviously have box plot because we did some independent runs for each configuration. And we also display the p-values, the pairwise p-values above couples of box plot. So what can we learn from this? First, it's interesting to compare the actual development schedule, so the early and the uniform one. And if we look across all the plots, we can see that in general, the blue one is never worse than the yellow one, and in 2 cases, it's statistically significantly better, meaning that the robots are not too different from what happens in real life, so they can actually benefit from developing early and then keeping their body fixed. And we also speculate that this could be due to the fact that evolution manages to optimize the controller for the time when the robot has a fixed body. So the controller is actually optimized for that specific body. Then it is also interesting to compare the results on non-developed robots, because in principle one would expect them to be super fast because the body is not changing, and so the brain is optimized for that specific body, and so in principle one would expect them to be super fast. But this is not really the case. You can see that the results are quite fuzzy, so it's a little better but also a little worse sometimes, and we speculate this to be due to the fact that development could indeed be beneficial, so depriving the robots from real development actually makes them run a bit less fast than the others. Some more insights could be gained from these plots here that display the velocity. So in this time, we don't have the distance run, but we have the velocity, average velocity on the last development stage on the y-axis. And the box plots are in a more or less similar relationship to what we have seen before. What is probably more interesting from here is to take into consideration the sizes of the robots. So the early ones are composed of 19 voxels, the early developed ones are composed of 19 voxels, the uniform developed ones of 21 voxels, and the non-developed ones are the smallest with 14 voxels. And so one would expect these to be the fastest one because obviously they are bigger and they could in principle benefit from much higher actuation power. But this is really not the case. And also these ones are not always the slowest ones. And so what we can learn from this plot here is that in general the size of the robot is does indeed play some role, but it's not the most important and impactful factor. But the controller being properly optimized is indeed what makes the robot run well or not. The last insight we can gain it from this plot here that shows the velocity along the lifetime of the agent, so along the development stages. And we can see that for early and uniform developing agents, there is a growing trend, meaning that indeed the size is somewhat impactful because bigger robots are actually benefiting from higher actuation power. But as we have seen before, this is probably not the most impactful factor. In fact, we can see for uniform developed ones, the trend is not so neat, and there are also moments when there is actually a decrease. So, what have we learned from this study? First thing, morphological development in artificial life is somewhat similar to development in real life concerning the schedule. So, it is better to develop early than to continuously grow. And also, we have learned that larger robots can be faster only if they're controlled from a proper brain. Last, here are a bunch of ideas for possible future works. So we could try to experiment with a neural CA-based representation or try to encompass environmental feedback in development, but we could also try to include early mortality. That is, robots that are not fast enough do not really develop. And so this is it for my presentation. And if you have any question, feel free to reach out. Thanks.